First of all, I wanted to say how deeply honored I am to be part of this wonderful event. And so grateful to you and everyone here for commemorating this important history. I always tell my students that part of the task in struggling for justice is you have to make history, but then you have to tell the history, and you have to defend and uphold that history. And what better way than to have this event in this place that used to be for military officers. It's now not an officers club, it's an all people's club. And to be remembering and honoring those heroes who stood up for justice and peace. This event at the Presidio Stockade, the Mutiny, was just one part of a very broad anti-war movement inside the military that shook the foundations of American military power. At every major military base in the United States, there was an anti-war group publishing so-called underground newspapers, GI newspapers. We know now that there were at least 400 of them all across the military, also on all the major ships, once the air war shifted to the Navy, and in many Air Force bases. There was widespread resistance in terms of desertion, AWOL, refusals of combat. In my book, I found 10 that I was able to document. Subsequent research has shown that there were probably hundreds of refusals to fight by frontline troops in combat divisions in Vietnam. And there were many acts of sabotage and resistance in the Navy, racial uprisings all across the military. As that clip that article that you mentioned from Colonel Heinel in the Armed Forces Journal in '71 said it well. The U.S. military was disintegrating from within. And there's no doubt that the resistance inside the ranks undermined the capacity of the U.S. to continue the ground war. And the troops were withdrawn, first of all, as a political gesture by Nixon to try to undercut the anti-war movement, but most importantly, because the troops were refusing to fight, and they had to be withdrawn. And then by 70 and 71, as the air war was increasing, the resistance spread to the Navy and the Air Force. This was a movement that contributed significantly to the end of the American aggression in Vietnam, and that was part of a broader movement, of course, throughout the country to stop the war. And these acts of resistance, last thing I'll say is how when we engaged in the resistance, I remember feeling this myself when I first started the protest, you're really scared. For a long time you think you're crazy, and because you're going crazy, you can't continue with this unjust war, and yet this is your duty. If you speak out, you're going to get in trouble, but you feel compelled to take that act. And as you do so, you begin to realize there are a lot of other guys in the barracks, in another units, who agree with you. And it's not just a single act, you become part of a movement. And you begin to feel that, well, maybe I'm a little crazy, but the real craziness is in the war. It's in society,
right,
in the madness that they are imposing upon us, and we have to resist it and fight back against it. And this is what we're all about. We're part of a movement of standing up for justice. And the act of these brave soldiers here at this place 50 years ago, they joined together, they inspired so many others to act, and they were part of a movement that, as I mentioned, ultimately helped to end the war.
Terrific. I'm a little curious, since I was too young for this movement. What did it feel like to be a part of this developing movement? You mentioned, David, that it felt a little like going crazy. I'm curious about, for others of you, Susan and Randy, what did it feel like? How did you know it was a movement?
I'll go back 50 years, which is kind of a little bit of time, I think, for all of us. Even though I wasn't in Vietnam, I took care of the Marines and the soldiers who returned and could hear their stories and listen to their pain and listen to what they had done overseas, and found it so horrendous and horrifying that I kind of knew it had to stop. And what I was saying earlier to some people is, I couldn't look at myself in the morning and not do something about it. And it was frightening. I just looked at the film clip and thought, oh, right, it was kind of funny dropping those leaflets on military bases, and it was terrifying. I faced 5 years in I don't think they knew what to do with me, but the prosecuting attorney, and I don't remember the military term, asked for 5 years. But what it did, and it was spoken about in the film, is that it frees you to say, okay, I've done this, and all of a sudden, and this was at my hospital, the military base, everybody seemed to be against American intervention in Vietnam. From the corpsman to the corpsways to the doctor to the Catholic chaplain. And it was then that we were able to bring more and more people in and bring more people to demonstrations. And just quickly, I guess like a lot of you may have just reviewed Fred Gardner's book on the Presidio 27, and I realized almost for the first time in 50 years how terribly horrifying the conditions were in the stockade and how inhumane. And again, how there weren't really a huge number of choices. You either said, no, you can't do this to me, and we're going to stop it. And I'll admit that I really did think 50 years ago we were going to stop American intervention in other countries, that we would be able to defeat American capitalism and imperialism, that we were bringing an end to poverty and an end to racism. And today we will continue in our struggle to provide this to be a just country, no matter how difficult it is.
Randy, can you talk a little bit about the Presidio 27 and what their motivations were?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that every guy that sat down in the little circle there and saying we shall overcome wasn't really an anti-war GI. I went into the stockade as an anti-war GI, Keith did certainly, as one of the 9 for Peace, but the stockade conditions were pretty harsh. Roy Pulley, who sadly can't be here today, lives up in Oregon, he's still alive, but he couldn't make it. He had they held him down and bent his finger back until he broke his finger, and his finger to this day sticks out wrong. Just for instance. And so, the conditions were pretty harsh, and and then they shot and killed, they shot Rusty Bunch in the back, the guard did. And so I think it's really important to recognize that a lot of acts of resistance didn't start off as conscious political plans, or a great analysis of the war effort or of U.S. imperialism or whatever, but really came about because of the fact that the situation that people were forced into facing themselves. So when the guys all broke ranks and went out there and sat down, there was 27 guys, there was 27 motives, I suppose, but the one thing that really united everybody was that they weren't going to take it anymore. And they were really, they were all, I think we could all probably say honestly that we really were going to, fight back.
Can you speak to the fact that, there were 27 men who sat down, there were probably 120 men who were in the stockade. What about those who didn't participate?
Well, there was quite a bit, there was meetings in the cell blocks to just say, are you going to do it? Are you going to do it? What's the plan? Etc. And there was quite a bit of planning that went in through, over the weekend before the Monday morning when we sat down, those of us that did. By the time the cell block meetings were over, we already knew, for instance, that the black GIs weren't going to do it. They had held a separate meeting and had talked it over among themselves, and they said, look, you guys, we know we're going to get it a lot worse than you will, and so we're going to not do this one. And the mutineers, for lack of a better word, those of us that were planning the action accepted that. I mean, it was a bitter pill, but we understood it well. And one of our demands was against racism. It wasn't like we were angry at them for the fact that they had said they weren't going to participate. Everybody knew that what everybody was up against. There were some pretty harsh sentences coming down for all kinds of reasons, and so there were people that didn't do it. Some of the 9 for Peace that had come in with Keith who were, you know, anti-war activists. You know, they had done this big action with the Night for Peace, and they didn't do it. You know, I mean, they were already convicted and doing big time. And so there were lots of reasons why people didn't join, but it's sort of profound that as many did as did.
So let's kind of move into some of the legal questions around this. For the men who were charged with mutiny, they had the option of having civilian defense attorneys as well as military defense attorneys. Brendan, can you talk a little bit about how the presence of civilian lawyers either changed or didn't change the role of the defense?
Maybe. Look, I'm sitting on the stage with some real heroes here. These two people and these two people, they put themselves on the line for something they believe, right or wrong, and they took consequences for it. I would just happen to be a lawyer that stumbled into this case, and I was simply doing my job as a lawyer. A little background, by the way, so you'll know where my head comes from. I grew up in Rhode Island. My dad was a major in World War II, did not see fighting combat because of a health issue. And his picture hung in our family home for all the days that I was there. I was not anti-military. I went to Georgetown College as a ROTC product. I knew I'd be drafted or I'd go to ROTC, and then went to law school. And after law school, I had 2 years to serve in the military. By then I was a first lieutenant. I was a captain in the transportation corps. By the way, I went to law school. I never one day wanted to be a lawyer. Not one day. In fact, as my professors would tell you, I didn't go to that many classes because I wasn't focused on being a lawyer. I wanted to be a businessman. But my life was changed when I was asked by some soldiers to defend him in this case, because for the first time in my life, I saw injustice, and it sickened me. You just look at that picture, the famous picture up here, and you don't have to be a lawyer to know that those kids, and I called them kids, they were about my age, because I was 28 at the time. They were 19, 20, 21, 22. They were kids, they were just sitting down in a stockade. That's the furthest thing from a common sense mutiny. Why did it become mutiny? Because generals and colonels saw this as a protest against the war and saw that they were bad actors and they wanted to teach them a lesson. And so I thought there was justice in the world. I'd never seen injustice. Growing up in the state of Rhode Island, I didn't see it in law school, and I was shocked. And it was that turned me into being a lawyer. Now, focusing on this particular case, I was just one of many lawyers. I had Emmett Geary right here, who was a lawyer who had served in Vietnam. He was an experienced lawyer. I had never been a lawyer until I got to the Presidio. Rich Millard was an experienced lawyer. Served in Vietnam as well. And by the way, by reading Fred Gardner's book, you'll remember that Rich Millard was the investigating officer. You all know that prior to an actual charge was what they call an Article 32 investigation. He investigated the case and he said there was no mutiny. He told the commanding officers there was no mutiny, and the colonels on up hid that fact virtually from the commanding general because they all wanted to make it a mutiny case. Howard DeKnight was an experienced lawyer. When I came into this picture, we were just a bunch of lawyers, some who had experience and some who didn't. I was not a JAG officer, I was in the Transportation Corps. So I always got a laugh out of the fact that these guys could be punished and I was immune. What could they do to me? I'm just a transportation guy. I had only 2 years. Some of them had longer than 2 years. So we could afford to be bold for our clients. And we criticized the system of military justice. But we worked together, whether we were in uniform, as we were, JAG officers, as those gentlemen were, or a civilian like Howard and I. We simply worked together, and we happened to be there. And we fought for each of these kids because what was done to them was wrong. When I heard that Larry Rydell and some of those first defendants were sentenced to 15, 16 years, it was the shock of my life. Because I didn't believe that anything was like that. And yet here in the system of military justice, there was virtually no justice. So it's happenstance that you get there. And you know, we're not cause-oriented people. We're like the emergency room surgeon. If you come in with a bullet wound in you, he doesn't want to know who you are. He has a body and he wants to fix you up and get you out and save you. That's what lawyers want to do. We talked about the motivations. I always thought the motivations were a parade thing. Some were conscientious objectives. Some were people that didn't belong there. Some were people that had done AWOL. No one had done any serious crimes. And so we related to these young people. We felt that military was wrong. And of course, years later, they were proven to be wrong. But civilian or military, it didn't matter. We all fought, and some took risks. I didn't think I was at risk, but as a matter of fact, I apparently angered General Larson because when we sent him a subpoena to come as a witness, he tore up the subpoena and ordered me to Vietnam. I was shocked that that could happen, and there were a couple of Irish reporters at the San Francisco paper named McAvoy. One was McAvoy and one was Murphy. They spent the days in court, the nights in the bars, and they wrote big stories. And one of the stories they wrote was what about this Captain Sullivan that was ordered to the war zone because of the way they defended people in trial. But the fact of the matter is my orders were canceled by the Secretary of the Army because I had only 6 months in service, and they knew that this was just a bold effort to get one of the lawyers out of the courtroom. Bottom line, of course, everybody worked together just as you would in any other case. We didn't focus on the Vietnam War. We didn't focus necessarily on the conditions in the prison. We focused on the fact that this is not mutiny. And that's what a lawyer should do, and that's what we worked to accomplish. And although the big sentences came down in the early trials of the 6 trials eventually, Washington was so upset at it that the JAG himself reduced the sentences to 2 years. And then the Court of Appeals reversed it. And a surprise out of the Court of Appeals, guess what they said? It's not mutiny. They were just sitting down and they disobeyed an order.
I would just want to add a word of gratitude as one who was also suing the Army, actually, in 1970. And I think for all of the GIs who were part of this resistance movement, the support we received from civilians, attorneys, folks who worked in the coffee house movement, Fred Gardner's here, I understand, a number of others who were part of it. Mr. Violet's here, a number of others who were part of the coffee house movement. Civilians who understood that we were isolated in the military, we were potentially victimized by these very repressive measures, and they stood up for us, they helped us, provided crucial support legally in terms of the coffee houses and many other ways. So this kind of movement inside the military really depends upon civilian support from the broader movement. So I think I just want to express that thank you from all of us for that support.
You're going to ask another question.
So why don't we talk a little bit about what the community response to the Presidio 27 was like? Outside of the military, within the movement, in the press. What was going on outside of the Presidio?
Well, I can say that as lawyers defending these young soldiers, we were thrilled that there were 50,000 people walking down Lombard Street and trying to push open the gate. But we were in court trying to deal with the legal problems we had, and while that felt good, I think it actually made the military more angry it caused the generals and the colonels to lean on their fellow officers who were the jurors, and it led to the big sentences. So I think it might have had a temporary negative effect on the early sentences. Once it got going, I think that it had the positive effect because Washington was so concerned about what they saw as abusive prosecutions that's why they stepped in a dramatic way and just nullified the sentences of some of these young men by reducing it to 2 years.
Brendan, from your perspective, you know, kind of inside the military, what do you think was the reason for the command here to push so hard for the mutiny charge, despite evidence to the contrary?
First of all, it's a terrible bad judgment, isn't it? It proved to be bad judgment. As I said, Rich Millard, investigating the thing before anybody really knew the facts, determined there was no mutiny. I mean, he's a genius, but you didn't need to be a genius, Rich. But they swept that under the rug. I think it was simply hardline military that could not tolerate the fact that there was a protest against the war. And, you know, they ran a facility. The Stockade was horrible conditions. That couldn't exist today. So there were a combination of factors, and I think that it was part to cover up their own negligence with respect to the Stockade and those issues, and to come down and take a strong stand. You can't have soldiers doing this.
Randy, do you want to talk a little bit about what it was like inside the Stockade?
Well, it was a crazy house. I mean, conditions were bad. They were actually, well, for some of us, you know, the Stockade conditions were bad enough, but then they sent some of us, some of whom are here tonight, over to Treasure Island, which was a Marine brig, because they hadn't been able to break us. So they sent them over to Marine brig for, you know, special handling, you know, a torture site, really. And, you know, if you think that you know, breaking a guy's finger by slowly breaking it back, or putting you in the wall and slamming into that, or, you know, I mean, they put us in the box and squirt urine on us, and I mean, you know, it was horrible.
What
Plus,
was the box?
Oh, the box was the segregation cells. They, you know, you go in a little segregation cell. It was like a cement box. We called it the box or the hole. So, I mean, you know, you don't want to dwell on that too much, but you know, it was bad conditions, and there's no surprise under those conditions that people, you know, this is supposed to be America, and I think for a lot of us it was a sort of a surprising shock to find out, you know, through the dirty underbelly of what life in America could be. You know, I mean, if you ask the Black Lives Movement people nowadays about why do black parents have to worry about their kids getting shot by the police when they're just coming home from high school or whatever.
Right.
You know, I mean, it's not like everything has turned into a bed of roses today. But we certainly had our share of grief, and that was the way that was.
I'd just like to go back to the social protest part of the question. I'm not an attorney, but I was a client of an attorney, and we knew at that time, and I think one of the things we need to learn today is that the power of protest, the power of organizing, of bringing people together to say this is unjust and we will change it, is enormous. And part of the military perspective is part of what is going on in our government today, which is that absolute power and control that says you're not going to change it. You may be the people who live here, but we have the power. We, the multinational corporations, have the money and the power and the influence. And if we, the people, don't stand up and say, we're going to take it from you, and we're going to do this nonviolently, collectively, and we're going to work together to do it. Part of what we dealt with around my court-martial was a balancing act of saying, we know that the current administrative authority really wants to get rid of you. They don't want you to be seen. So what do? You get out into the streets and you get the publicity and you talk to the reporters and you make that movement known to the people. It is, I'll just say, I am an old-fashioned organizer and I really do believe that if we pull ourselves together, we will make those changes. And we need to learn from what happened with the Presidio. If people hadn't gone to Washington, what would have happened to the sentences? Do we really think they would have gotten smaller as the cases went on? I don't believe that. I believe once we move that power and you say to your elected representative, or you say to your neighbor, or you say to the people you work with, we need to get it together and we're going to make that change. So it's more than the courts and, oh my goodness, right? It's 50 years later and I still go to the streets and we still need to go and elect people who in fact will represent us and make those changes.
Yeah.
There's absolutely no question that this case was affected by what happened, by people paying attention to it. Congressmen got involved, and they started to ask questions. So, and once people saw the picture, saw the mutiny charge, and saw 15 years, it was a wonderful thing to be able to rally around. And the Department of Army was scared about it, and that's why they took dramatic action to reduce it. And by the way, if you read Frank Gardner's book, command influence pervades every aspect of military justice, right? Every aspect of it. And it pervades military justice in the Court of Appeals in Washington as well. And the only thing that affected them was the fact that the Army was embarrassed at what happened. They saw General Larson, by the way, who retired somewhat in disgrace and lost 1 star upon retirement. Yeah. They saw him. It was an embarrassment, and the fact that people kept talking about it made them pay attention to it. It's as simple as that. It's a combination of things.
Can you explain what command influence is for those who might not know?
Yes, command influence is this. Let's pretend you're the jury, and I'm the general. Come on over for coffee. We got some trouble over at the courthouse. You better give these guys a harsh sentence. That's command influence. Put your friends on the court. They play sports together. They eat together. They're at the officers club together. And they're the jury. And they know the general's upset about this. How do they know? The general's told them. There's no secret. And so when they deliberate about whether or not there's mutiny, and then what sentence to give, they think in their mind, I'm going to see the general in the morning. So command influence pervades the military system, and it certainly did here.
So in the film clip that we saw from Sir No Sir, told the story of how the Presidio 27 fits into a larger GI movement. And I'd like to hear from some of our panelists their thoughts about how the Presidio 27 fits into that story, what it pulled upon, what it influenced, how it fit there.
Jack.